So the next speaker is Vitor Costa. It's a joint work with several people written there, right? And then I'm the only one co-author that's present. Just make a quick introduction. No? It's a PhD from IMPA, and then this part of the attempt to understand the level of the I put there the level of the inflation target in a country would have fiscal fragility. It's going to define precisely what is fiscal fragility. And the paper just was accepted for the AJ macro, been given in several places, and is the idea that essentially that people forgot a little bit about the idea of the fiscal dominance. People, when the U.S. was having high interest rate and the debt was accumulating, some very good people wrote papers about monetization of the debt. No, Sergeant Wallace was the main one, and then there was the literature of fiscal theory of the price level, where people were, Michael Woodford and Sims and so forth, but then people forgot more or less about this because the inflation was under control in the US. And then I used to say, and I would give the talk in several places in the US, Americans forgot about these questions, but not in Brazil. I never forgot it because the fiscal problem was being all the time present, was a constant. So, we decided to study what should be the level of the inflation target. And people think that, oh, do you think Brazil is in a fiscal dominance? I say, no. Then it's a monetary dominance. You can do whatever you want in the fiscal. So this is totally wrong. This duality of Lipper was a little bit misleading. Either you binary, either in a fiscal dominance or in a monetary dominance. I think it's very misleading. And there is some parallel literature in the US appearing, like the one I was referring, Smith and Walters, or the estimate, and the US oscillate between one and another. It was a big advance. We're not influenced by them. They were not influenced by us. And also this theory of the debt that was funded and the debt that was unfunded by Bianchi. That is very relevant. Sargent, when he speaks, say, oh, the US sometimes got too high debt and they finance it through inflation with higher tax, but it doesn't have a model. But it's very well clear in his mind, I think. So, but what we do here is that the inflation target with a country that's under severe fiscal problems is a big mistake. So, and that's what Verlang said in the morning, where I was not here. He asked me a question because I was correct, And then 15 years later, I said, I have the answer. So that means I wrote a model, and this is about this, what the level, the inflation target in a place like Brazil is. But another problem is that once you got down, to increase the inflation target is very complicated. So I'm not saying that, but was a mistake to get it lower. Got all the sort of problems. So Vitor.
Hello. Thank you, Professor, for introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm really honored to be talking today, especially in this panel in your homage. And so Professor already talked a little bit about what we're going to present here. The paper is called Inflation Targeting Under Fiscal Fragility. And so the main idea, as Professor was saying, is that our question is essentially how should we set the inflation target in an economy which is indebted. right? So we have during the 90s, we've had the adoption of the inflation targeting regime in several countries. We know how it's supposed to work, right? So central bank sets, or some authority sets, an inflation target, and the central bank is supposed to adjust its instruments to follow this rule, this whatever it takes, right? And the idea behind this is that by doing so, it will coordinate future expectations towards this target, and then everything will work out. But in practice, what we see is that targets are missed frequently, and one could attribute this simply to policy errors by the monetary authority. But we think that, and not just we, but a lot of the literature likes to connect this with the fiscal situation of the country. And why is that so? Because when a country is indebted, it has a higher temptation to use inflation as a sort of partial default mechanism, meaning that in order to keep inflation on target, a country is often required to do fiscal adjustments that are too costly. So it often avoids to do so, and we end up with a higher inflation than the target. So at the same time, people dislike inflation, and when we use inflation to surprise the market and have this sort of partial default mechanism, you damage monetary policy credibility. So the whole mechanism doesn't work right. And what we argue in this paper is that the target itself is important in balancing this trade-off. So here is the Brazilian experience with inflation targeting regime, and you can see that in several years it was not close to the target, and not even inside the boundaries of the upper and lower limit that are tolerable. And then in the later years, we've had this change of this reduction of the target, which was what the professor was talking about. And since then, we have seen that inflation seems to be always close to the upper limit. And this year, expectations are that it will be again over the upper limit, and also inflation expectations. Not even so, the central bank collects these expectations from the market, and not even 5 years from now we have anchored the expectations around the 3% target. They are around 3.5% in 2030. So it seems to be there seems to be a lot of
and
doubts.
that's very high, like 15% interest rate.
Yeah, and we have one of the highest interest rates of the world. So this is the current combination of policy that we have in Brazil, and we are going to illustrate our model with the Brazilian experience. So we model an economy in which there are only two types of agents: the policymaker and private agents. And the policymaker is both a fiscal and central bank, fiscal authority and central bank. So there is no conflict between the monetary and fiscal authorities. Both of them want what's best for the private agent, the population. But so they are actually the same person in the model. But private agents, they form expectations over the policymaker actions, and decide how much of that to hold. And so the policymaker will choose the combination of monetary and fiscal policy to maximize social welfare. And the policymaker will end up with a trade-off of keeping inflation on target and avoiding deviating costs, meaning that private agents dislike inflation, so the policymaker will try to minimize it. But private agents also like public spending, or they dislike cuts to the public spending. So there's an incentive for the policymaker to also use inflation and reduce public debt. So the solution here will be, so whenever the policymaker is deviating, he will be doing that optimally. It will not be interpreted as a policy mistake, but rather that he was incentivized to do so, okay? And what we obtain is that what the policymaker will do, and whether it will be credible or not, it's dependent on that limits, which are endogenous to the model. So if that is too high, there will be too much of an incentive to deviate, and we will be in what's called the fiscal dominance zone, an analogy with the literature. And in this zone, inflation will be completely detached from the target. If debt is low, then it's easier for the government to follow the target, and we will be in a total credibility zone, which we call the no crisis zone, in an analogy with the sovereign debt literature, which we also take some inspiration from. And in between these two zones, we will find a fiscal fragility zone. So, and this is, I guess, one of our contributions here is finding this multiple equilibria zone in which the inflation choice by the policymaker depends on expectations from the agents. So it can be better for the policymaker to deviate if the public loses trust exogenously in the policymaker commitment to the target. And inside the zone, we actually have a behavior that is what we think is very close to what we see in practice here in Brazil and other emerging economies. So expected inflation is always detached from the target, and we see that even in the long run in Brazil. And delivering the target is costly, meaning that we need a high real interest rate and a lot of fiscal effort to keep delivering the target. What we also find is that if we raise the target, this real interest rate, which is required to deliver the target, is reduced, and the lower bound of the fiscal fragility zone is increased, and also the amount of periods required for the government to do an austerity policy to exit the fiscal fragility zone. And in our calibrations, if we find a result that the optimal target is the lowest possible target, so the lowest possible inflation level, such that the target is credible. So ideally, we want to have the lowest possible target, since people dislike inflation, so long as it is credible in our model. So as I was saying, we draw from several inspirations from the literature. The professor was talking about Sargent and Wallace and this literature that followed, and we also base a lot of our model on confidence crisis literature, especially Cole and Kehoe and Calvo, and a lot of the papers that followed. So I'm gonna introduce the model. I'm worried about time here, but you can say if I need to go faster. So the policymaker will maximize the welfare of
Is
agents.
that actually, you don't have a sovereign debt problem, no? It's just purely domestic debt.
Yeah.
But the techniques from sovereign debt sometimes are useful for us. So there's some people got confused in that. So this.
Okay. Yeah. So the analogy comes from the partial default from inflation, is like a sort of default. This is why we have this influence. So our model is very simple, very short, in the sense that we don't have shocks, or we only have a sunspot, which will be a sort of expectation shock that will come up in the model. And as a result, we can model the policymaker as simply choosing inflation and debt. It doesn't need to set an interest rate or fiscal policy. It can straight up select its inflation and debt, because there's a mapping between those things. And what it will maximize is the intertemporal utility of agents, which is composed of a term that is the current utility, which depends on consumption of both private goods and public goods that are provided by the government, and a term which is the disutility of inflation, which is a really compact form of addressing the fact that people dislike inflation. This can also be thought of the central banker loss function, or something that mirrors the fact that there's some cost of inflation that we want to minimize. And the budget constraint of the government, well, it has to spend money, or it has to spend on public goods, right, which are not provided by the market, and it has to pay for previous debt, and it does that by issuing new debt and by a fixed tax on the endowment. So the endowment, the tax here can be fixed, because in this specification, it will be analogous to raising taxes would be analogous to cutting spending. So we concentrate all the analysis in the spending variable here, the public good, but it could be extended to variable taxes, so long as it has some welfare distortion in agents. And one important thing about the utility is that it's linear on the private good. This is because as a result, we have a risk neutral utility, which is essential for the closed format solutions that we find in the model, but it can be generalized. This is typical from the sovereign debt literature to have this risk neutral private consumption. And the last term which I had to explain is this epsilon here, which is a penalty for deviating from the target. So it's separate from the welfare cost of inflation here, in the sense that if we miss the target, agents lose trust on the economy, maybe they invest less, or so we have a lower output. Okay, maybe we scare agents away from foreign agents from the country, or some mechanism. This is also a condensed form of this mechanism, and it works in a permanent way. So if the policymaker misses the target so the target's denoted PA, and if it misses the target at any point in time, it loses credibility forever. So private agents will have essentially the same problem, except they choose private consumption and private debt public debt holdings, and they will maximize the same utility, except there is no inflation term here, because they don't choose inflation, so it's irrelevant to enter it or not in the function. And they form expectations about what the government will choose in the next period when choosing the debt. And so the only shock in the model will be a sunspot shock, which will emerge when we have multiple equilibria in the model. So solving for the first order conditions, we get first order condition on the equilibrium real interest rate that is required. And it depends on the long run real interest rate and the amount of inflation. I would say like the partial default here, the inverse of the inflation. So the larger the inflation is with respect to the expected inflation, the lower the real interest rate. And this is how the timing of the model works. First of all, we have some spot variable, which I'm going to explain a little bit more later. And the policymaker will tie its behavior to the sunspot variable whenever multiple equilibria are possible. And after choosing inflation, or choosing to follow the target or deviating, which it will be like a binary choice, the policymaker will choose the next period level, that level, and then private agents, based on what they observe, form next period expectation and choose how much debt to hold. So in equilibria, there's I'm going to skip the definition, but it's a standard definition. Those things have to be, the demand and supply of debt has to be the same, and market clearing conditions have to hold, etc. So if expected inflation is high, the policymaker will have by this equation here, the policymaker will be subject to a higher real interest rate if it doesn't follow if it tries to follow the target. So it's costly. If it decides to deviate, then it will deviate to the optimal inflation deviation. So what we first do is that we solve for this optimal inflation deviation and then decide whether it's optimal to deviate or not. So it's like a backward induction solution. So first we solve for the policy mix when the policymaker decides to deviate, and this has to be a fixed point solution between the actual inflation chosen and the expected inflation from the agents, right? So the optimal deviation will be a combination of the current, it will be the inflation level PD that maximizes the current utility of agents plus the long run steady state, which the economy enters after deviating. It enters in a perfect foresight steady state without any shock. And after deviating, the policy maker loses completely the credibility, and it has no choice but to keep delivering the same inflation forever. So this third term here is the welfare cost of this inflation. So we maximize this, and we have to maximize this given a level of PE, which is the expected inflation, but PE is formed by taking this deviation into consideration, so this is a fixed point problem. And what we find is that since the government has a concave V function, which is the function, the utility of spending, it wants to stabilize public spending and debt forever. So it will choose a constant level of debt, steady state here, right from the start, which implies a constant spending level. And it will choose inflation which solves this first order condition here, in which the first term is the marginal benefit of an additional inflation in terms of the marginal utility of public goods relative to the private goods. And in the second term, there is the marginal cost of inflation. So I don't think I was too, I talked about this. We assume that this is at least, this has to be convex, and this is a V here is a concave function, which is standard assumption over these models. And as a result, we find what I already anticipated, which is that when we take into consideration the deviation, and assuming that inflation has been always on target, there are 3 zones that are possible. So, and it always depends on the belief of the agents. So how does it work? Suppose that even if agents, when agents believe that the government will deviate, it is optimal for the government to follow the target. Then the government will follow the target because agents will believe that will know that the government knows that it's optimal. So this is the only solution of the model. And the exact opposite happens on the fiscal dominance zone. So even if agents believe that the government wants to keep inflation on target, it's better for the government to deviate. So agents will correctly predict that the government will deviate. And what's new here is the fiscal fragility zone, so which has this property that if agents believe that the government wants to keep inflation on target, it will be optimal to keep inflation on target. But if agents believe that the government wants to deviate, then it will be optimal to deviate. So we have 2 possible solutions to equilibrium. And there's no way we can choose between those 2. So we actually hand this to an exogenous variable, the eta from the model, which has a fixed probability f of happening. And this is the expected inflation of the model, which is taken with regard to the probability of the sunspot. So the sunspot here, the closest explanation can be, for example, an election result that points toward a more fiscally relaxed politician taking over. So people instantly lose confidence in the target, and as a result, the government has to deviate. So after solving the model, what we do is that we start we ask the question, okay, but what if we change the target? And this is the main result of the paper. So first of all, what we find is that rollover cost is decreasing the target. So meaning that it's easier for the government to deliver the target when the target is higher because the real interest rate is lower. And this is due to the fact that the deviation, which here has to be a deviation ratio, it has to be higher for a higher level of the inflation target, and this implies, due to the convexity of the inflation cost, that the government will not be willing to rise inflation as much. It's like people dislike hyperinflation, so the government doesn't want to raise the inflation as much. So when it deviates in a higher target, it will deviate to a lower deviation, okay? Because people dislike hyperinflation. And as a result, we see this graph for the real interest rate, which is falling until, as the target is raised, until we enter the no crisis zone, which is the next the next result, which says that the lower limit of the fiscal fragility zone, so exactly the boundary between the no crisis and the fiscal fragility, it raises when we raise the inflation target, meaning that it's some debt zones that would be incompatible with full credibility may become compatible, may become credible. Okay? So I'm going briefly to explain the numerical example we did based on an episode of the 2002 Brazilian confidence crisis, which was after the election. People were scared that the president that was gonna enter, that he was going to abandon the inflation targeting regime. So his inflation expectations rose, and so this is a sort of the sunspot shock happening there, right? And we calibrated the model so that we could. We calibrated the model for standard values when we could find them, and the value that is more or less free here is this fixed cost of inflation, which we calibrate so that at that level at the time we had a crisis, we had a fiscal fragility zone. And the solution, so this is the solution, the optimal fiscal policy in the model. We see that the optimal fiscal policy is simply to keep debt constant in the no crisis zone and also in the fiscal dominance zone, because there's no reason to increase or reduce debt. But when we are in the fiscal fragility zone, what we see is that the policymaker wants to slowly get out of the fiscal fragility zone. So this is the current debt versus the next period debt, and what the policymaker is doing here is that he's reducing step by step, like year by year here, the debt levels until he is out of the no crisis zone. So austerity here is optimal. But if that's too high, then the optimal is actually to just go to the fiscal dominance zone right away and do not make any austerity. And so we obtain different expected inflation levels and an amount of years or periods in our model that are required to exit the fiscal fragility zone in different debt levels. Also, we plot the same functions by varying the target, and we can see that as the target becomes higher, the policy functions dislocate to the right, which is so the no crisis zone, it starts from ends in a higher place. So a way of gaining credibility would be raising the target. And as a result, we can optimize the inflation target by saying, since we have a cost of inflation and we have that result from the policy function shifting, and what we find is that policymakers want the inflation target to be, or that the optimal target in the model is the one that is the lowest target, such that the current debt level is in the no crisis zone. And just as a coincidence, the level that the inflation target that the model pointed in the level of 70%, which was the debt level at the time in Brazil, was 4.5%, which was what the government set years later. So in that first graph, we can see that later on the government chose to raise the target to 4.5, and it actually, and inflation was anchored for a while at this region until fiscal policy started to become more loose. in later governments. So it kind of fits with our predictions of the model. And I guess that was it. So in our concluding remarks, even though we focus our model for Brazil, we think that it can be very relevant to other economies that are dealing with high debt. For example, a situation that maybe some advanced economies might be dealing with. So maybe raising the target can be a way to anchor expectations toward the inflation again. And that's it. So forgot to put the thank you slide, but thank you. Yeah.